morning. We have Deborah Roberts with us today. Deborah is one of the world's extreme sustainability practitioners, having led a remarkable period of change in Durban, which has been a pioneer in trying to test and implement a whole range of innovations around sustainable development, specifically around climate change and biodiversity. So we're going to be talking to her about the operational challenges of the transition that Durban is trying to lead in South Africa and its implications for other parts of the world. So Deborah, it's wonderful to have you here. And what we're trying to get a sense of is, since the political transition now in South Africa, almost 20 years ago in 1994, how has Durban fared? What are the kind of challenges you faced as a city? And what are the responses that we've seen over the last 20 years or so?
Oh, thanks, Arun. It's great to be here with you. I think what we've seen is an unusually complex mix of challenges, in the sense that when we emerged into the new democracy, obviously society had to develop a new set of priorities. We had lost the sort of normative framework of the past apartheid-driven system, and the question as a society is, what were we shooting for? Now, given the kind of problems we came from, the priorities of society at that stage were very much development-oriented. And it was very much development in a narrow sense. It was about dealing with infrastructure deficit, building houses, getting everyone to have access to clean water. And there wasn't a lot of debate in that context around broader issues of sustainability. And in fact, I think there was an inherent fear that sustainability might mean that the bigger development project for the country might be compromised. And I think that laid the sort of framework for action for the next couple of decades, is how did we bring in the longer term view into a society that was very much, and correctly so, driven by immediate and short-term needs.
And when did this transition happen? Roughly 10 years after 1994? So
quite frankly, I wish we could say the transition had happened. We're still in the process of it. And I think for me, that's been one of the most surprising things, is that beginning to institutionally change the groundwork for operation is a long-term project in and of itself. And I would say we're still transitioning. It's still difficult in the development discourse to really find a place for quite esoteric issues in the South African environment of biodiversity and climate change adaptation. And so, because it's been a complex space and a difficult transition, there hasn't been one solution. In fact, we've deployed a range of 10% solutions across the board to see where we can prod the system into incremental change, in the hope that all of those incremental changes in fact add up to that one big transition to society, which is focused not only on human well-being, but understands that human well-being in a broader sustainability, a broader resilience context.
So, Durban is an interesting city because it's large, at least within the South African context. It has a large rural population. It has concentrated challenges in urban areas. It has development issues that are there. How have you tried to keep the balance between the rural and the urban in Durban?
Well, we're quite a schizophrenic city, and I think there are very few cities like us, in the sense that within our formal boundaries, the majority of the land use and the majority of the tenure is traditional. So it's rural. So effectively we have two forms of governance. We have traditional city hall, but we also have effective tribal leadership. And that's really required us to have two entirely different tool sets. So if you look at the city hall environment, there we work within planning regulations, planning legislation, zoning, the traditional tools that I think are known and understood. The moment we cross into traditional governance, there it's much more about stewardship. It's about winning the hearts and minds of people, because you no longer have the plan. You no longer have the law on your side. And that's required us literally to develop these two tool sets, to have different teams who work in the different spaces. What we are finding, however, is that is not an absolute boundary. There are learnings from both sides which we are beginning to pull across. So, for example, the concept of stewardship, getting community to buy into the fact that they have a responsibility over and above that of government to assist with adapting themselves to climate change, to assist with biodiversity. We're bringing now into the formal environment with large private landowners. By the same token, we're having to get traditional leadership ready for the idea that there will be town planning schemes.
Yes, there will be more formal systems of...
Absolutely. And so we're beginning to see a blurring of those traditional boundaries, but it is causing us as an institution to have to be nimble and smarter in the way we engage with local governance. And that's not really what local government was set up for. You know, its strength is it never changes, and its weakness is that it never changes.
Exactly. That's why Durban is such an interesting case, because it makes this transition, which is so important for many parts of Africa and other parts of the world, because this is how the real world is structured, around traditional communities, informality in some senses, which is also, you know, quite active in the formal part of Durban, and of course the government. So being able to transition between them. What are the things that you sort of learned over the last many years in working from government and trying to address these questions?
Yeah. And it really has been a game of which pieces on the chessboard do you move. And when you look at it in that sense of transition, you realize this is not a journey you can take by yourself. One of our early lessons is we've realized that you've got to have a lot of people testing out a variety of different approaches. So one of our key lessons has been to build a whole cadre of leaders, champions in various sectors around various issues in order to enable us to effect this transition. If you hold in your head the idea that the transition is driven by a range of 10% solutions rather than a silver bullet, you need a lot of experiments running throughout your city in a variety of contexts. So we've turned away from perhaps the traditional look at the developmental transition, you know, how many roads, how many pipes, how much green space, to how many champions can we have in the right places. And it's really begun to focus on the socio-institutional elements of change, the people. Because all of these barriers, goals that we set ourselves, they're societally driven, and I don't think we understand that.
Absolutely. For the Global South, this is absolutely central, using people and institutions as the way forward to deal with sustainability.
And so that's an extraordinary tension now in the governance space, is what is local government's priority? Putting your head down and getting the local work done, helping people at home, or realizing you can do a great deal of that, and without this bigger regional, national, international framework, you will at some point be limited. So the question is, where do you put your resources? And you know, that's an interesting space now. Obviously, we've formed a lot of partnerships internationally to help us with that. But it is a big choice. And the question is, I think, as the role of the city region and city state becomes more prominent in dealing with global questions, it's a big question we're going to have to look at, is how do you take this forward, dealing with both of the needs that now...
How does this play out in the politics of the city and the city hall? Because at one end you have, you know, tremendous international profile and a lot of impact, but there are always day-to-day sort of battles to be fought in terms of service delivery, development, etc. How does that play out, you know, as a sustainability practitioner? How does that work?
It's schizophrenic. I mean, I don't think there's any other word for it, because you're constantly juggling a million balls in the air. Because obviously from a political profile, there's a strong desire to have Durban seen as a leader. But many of those long-term ideas, and here we come full circle to where we started, still contradict in the minds potentially of some leadership the short-term objectives of what we're trying to achieve. And it's constantly looking at, you know, trying to balance an argument where this investment of time and resources in international is seen to have enough value to the city to warrant it, but also demonstrating how that longer-term value might have shorter-term benefits in the way we address our current development needs. And this is really where these outreach issues into stewardship showing us how, if we get communities involved, you can manage the city more cost effectively if individuals take up some of these sustainability challenges. How there are new views around what an economy might look like. And, you know, Durban is quite hardwired in. We're the petrochemical center of South Africa. We've got all the big logistics infrastructure with the port. We're the lifeblood, in many cases, of SADC, transport and logistics. beginning to open the doors into some debates around there may be another economy. We can't escape the fact that we literally are a small city stuck on the tail end of Africa in a new world where fossil fuel is hugely expensive, where we're not transporting a great deal of goods around the world. We've got to develop a new...
Yes, you need to look more services oriented and also primary sector, sustainable.
Absolutely. So we're using that ability to push the door, and I must admit the door is only open about this wide, but to show that there is another vision. And I think that's the fact that there's a continuity of purpose, and I think that's another good thing that we've done, is we've held institutional continuity over decades. And that's created enough of institutional memory that small progress has not been lost. In fact, what it's been done has been very carefully collected and treasured and ordered so that we begin to develop a bigger narrative. And I think that's been part of our success, staying power, being able to coordinate the lessons and constantly articulate that back into City Hall, and being brave about that articulation in the face of often quite severe challenge.
So this new economy that you're talking about, which is less dependent on fossil fuel and logistics and moving things around, what is the role of sort of biodiversity and ecosystems in that? Because I think you've been experimenting with that for a long time. Absolutely. And that's a new base that's going away from the sort of traditional model.
Absolutely.
Where you try and move more and more people off the land, and you sort of use a tremendous amount of fossil fuel kind of subsidization of that process. How would you see that playing out?
And for us, it was a big message. It's a simple message, and it's something that I think should be at the back of every African urbanist's mind. Is, what is the powerhouse of the African city? It's people. It's particularly a youth dividend, and it's our huge ecosystems that are still largely intact. And the question is, how do you use those in new spaces? And we think that begins to set up a different model for land tenure, for urban financing. Particularly in cities like ours where the skills base is very low, there's a huge opportunity to begin to take those ecosystems, reimagine them as ecological infrastructure, which is cost effective and within certain limits, probably your most adaptable infrastructure in the African city. Use our large populations, many of them youthful, to begin to manage that infrastructure, just as we've got engineers managing pipes and overhead power lines. Train people to begin to manage that. And that management can take a variety of different forms. Your simple entry level, removing the alien invasives so that we get more water flowing into our catchments, into our impoundments. The city is already facing a water crisis. All the way through to the other end of the opportunity spectrum, we're a huge domestic tourist centre. How do you capture that? And South Africans are a very outdoor society, using these open areas to create recreational and tourism opportunities and creating the business base in our local communities to use that. But then to begin to look at the financial flows, how do we use our downstream industries, very water dependent, to create the financial flows that support the traditional leader in the upper catchment who is responsible for managing? Absolutely. And we're beginning to have that in play now. We've got a very large project which is across municipal boundaries, involves a number of municipalities in our largest water supplying catchment, the Mgeni River, to say we need to look at this. We've got the full range of society, all the way from rural, traditional, poor, through to wealthy, urban, and beginning to tie all those bits together in a management program with all the various complex government and governance institutions around the table. So forming a partnership, getting buy-in and leadership from everyone to say, how do we begin to look at this over the long term? How do we tackle the land management issue and begin to look at these financial flows? And this is where the international partnerships have become useful, looking, for example, at some of the water partnerships that have been developed in South America and how they've worked. And so began to tie the international resources with our local resources, getting the stakeholders together, tying it to an immediate problem. Water is an immediate problem for development in Durban. And getting those leaders that we've built now to step forward and to take control and lead. So it's a very complex socio-institutional system that you're constantly maneuvering. Within that, taking biodiversity out of the green elitist rhino and sunset tight imagery into hardworking, everyday, cost-effective ecological infrastructure, and that's really been
and livelihoods, because lots of people get jobs out of this. It helps people move out of poverty. So it's a remarkable way of actually lifting the floor.
The question is, what is the value chain?
Yes, exactly.
So once you've entered people into the green economy,
Yes.
where do they then go?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's where we haven't quite got the answer yet, and that's a space where
And the social mobility question, which comes with that, which is central.
Exactly.